In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a priceless blue Mauritius stamp vanishes from Colonel Bantry's locked study, sparking a web of suspicion. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eye unravels a tangle of motives, greed, envy, precision, desperation, among four suspects: a cunning dealer, a jovial friend, a meticulous appraiser, and a charming widow. With a wax smudge, a desk scratch, and a clever trap, she exposes the thief in a thrilling showdown, proving that even the smallest clue can reveal the darkest secrets. Chapter 1. The Vanished Treasure. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest drawing room in St. Mary Mead, dappling the chintz-covered armchairs and the polished mahogany table. She sat by the window, her delicate hands moving rhythmically, knitting a pale lavender shawl with the precision of long habit. The soft click of her needles was the only sound, save for the occasional chirp of a thrush in the garden beyond. It was a scene of serene domesticity, one that belied the sharp mind at work beneath her gentle exterior. The tranquility was shattered by the abrupt arrival of Colonel Arthur Bantry, his heavy footsteps echoing through the hall before he appeared in the doorway, his ruddy face flushed with agitation. His usually impeccable tweed jacket was slightly askew, and his white mustache bristled with indignation. "Miss Marple," he declared, barely pausing to greet her, "a calamity has struck. My blue Mauritius, the 1856, you know, the pride of my collection, has vanished from my album." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, her mild blue eyes lifting to meet his. "Dear me, Colonel," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of calm curiosity. "That is distressing. Pray, do sit down and tell me everything." She gestured to the armchair opposite, her demeanor as composed as if he had announced a mislaid umbrella rather than the theft of a philatelic treasure worth thousands. The colonel sank into the chair, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "It's unthinkable," he began, his voice a mix of outrage and bewilderment. "I've had that stamp for years, bought it from a reputable dealer in London, cost me a small fortune, kept it in my study, locked in the album, safe as houses. Or so I thought." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Last night, I went to show it to a guest, Mrs. Carver, charming woman, staying with us for a few days, and when I opened the album, the sleeve was empty. Not a trace of it, just the blasted empty pocket staring back at me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite concern, though her mind was already sifting through possibilities. "The album was in your study, you say? And the study was locked?" "Locked tight," the colonel confirmed, nodding vigorously. "I keep the key on me at all times, in my waistcoat pocket. The window was latched too, no sign of tampering. I checked every inch of the room this morning, thinking I might have misplaced it, but no. It's gone, Miss Marple, and I'm at my wits' end." She set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap. "And who was in the house yesterday evening, Colonel? Anyone who might have had access to the study?" The colonel frowned, his bushy brows knitting together as he considered. "Well, let's see. There was Mrs. Carver, of course, our guest. Then Dr. Langston, Henry, you know, old friend and fellow collector, dropped by for a drink. He's always been keen on my stamps, though he's got a fine collection himself. Miss Thorne, the appraiser, was there earlier in the day to value a few pieces for me. And then there's Mr. Voss, the dealer who sold me the blue Mauritius in the first place. He came by to discuss a potential auction. That's the lot, I think." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her face remained serene. "4 visitors, each with their own connection to your collection," she mused. "And no one else could have entered the study?" "Not a soul," the colonel said firmly. "Dolly, Mrs. Bantry, that is, was in the drawing room with me most of the evening, and the servants were in the kitchen or their quarters. It's a puzzle, Miss Marple, a dashed puzzle." She nodded, her mind already turning over the characters involved, each one slotting into place like the pieces of a familiar pattern. A dealer with knowledge of the stamp's value, a friend with a collector's envy, an appraiser with opportunity, and a guest whose presence seemed conveniently timed. Each, she knew, could have a motive hidden beneath their outward civility. She thought of old Mr. Harmon in the village, who had once borrowed a neighbor's prize rose for a flower show, claiming it was an honest mistake. People, she reflected, were rarely as innocent as they appeared. "Tell me, Colonel," she said, her voice gentle but probing, "did anyone linger near the study yesterday, or show particular interest in the blue Mauritius?" The colonel rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Well, Voss was in the study with me for a bit, looking over the album. He's always been a bit too keen on that stamp, if you ask me. Langston popped in to admire it too, said something about it being a collector's dream. Miss Thorne was all business, but she handled the album when she was valuing things. Mrs. Carver didn't go near the study, as far as I know, but she asked a lot of questions about the stamp over dinner. Thought it was just polite interest, but now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts darting to a village girl who had once asked too many questions about a missing brooch, only to be found wearing it days later. "Curiosity can be revealing," she said. "I should like to meet these people, Colonel. Perhaps you might invite them to the house tomorrow. A small gathering, nothing formal. I find people are often most themselves when they think no one is watching." The colonel brightened, seizing on the suggestion. "Capital idea. I'll have Dolly arrange it. You'll get to the bottom of this, Miss Marple. I know you will. You've a knack for these things. Like that business with the vicar's silver last year." She inclined her head modestly, picking up her knitting once more. "I shall do my best, Colonel. Now, tell me more about this blue Mauritius. A stamp of such rarity must have quite a story." As the colonel launched into a detailed account of the stamp's history, its origins in Mauritius, its misprinted beauty, its journey to his collection, Miss Marple listened attentively, though her mind was already weaving a different narrative. The vanished treasure was not merely a stamp, but a window into human nature, and she knew that somewhere among the dealer, the friend, the appraiser, and the guest lay the truth, waiting to be uncovered by her quiet, unassuming scrutiny. Chapter 2. The Suspects Assemble. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a crisp clarity, bathing the Bantry estate in a soft golden light that promised a day of deceptive calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out at the dew-kissed roses in her garden, her mind already turning over the puzzle of Colonel Bantry's missing blue Mauritius stamp. The colonel had telephoned early, his voice brimming with nervous energy, to confirm that the 4 suspects would gather at his home that afternoon under the guise of discussing his stamp collection. "Dolly's arranging a little tea," he had said. "Nothing to ruffle feathers. You'll come, won't you, Miss Marple?" She had assured him she would, her tone as mild as ever, though her curiosity was as sharp as the knitting needles now resting in her basket. At precisely 2:30, Miss Marple arrived at Bantry Hall, her black handbag tucked under her arm, and her hat, a sensible felt affair with a single feather, set neatly atop her white hair. Mrs. Dolly Bantry greeted her at the door, her plump cheeks flushed with the effort of playing hostess under such trying circumstances. "Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, drawing Miss Marple into the hall. "Arthur's in a state, positively fuming about that stamp. I've told him not to make a fuss in front of the guests, but you know how he is." Miss Marple patted her friend's arm reassuringly, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "Men do take these things so personally, don't they? But we shall see what can be done." The drawing room was a picture of understated elegance, with its heavy velvet curtains, polished oak furniture, and a fire crackling in the hearth to ward off the autumn chill. The suspects were already assembled, arranged around a low table, set with a silver tea service and an array of sandwiches and scones. Miss Marple slipped into a corner chair, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the room with the keenness of a hawk watching a field. Colonel Bantry stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his mustache twitching as he made small talk about the weather. His attempt at nonchalance was betrayed by the occasional glance toward the locked cabinet, where his stamp albums were now safely stored. Mrs. Bantry bustled about, pouring tea and offering plates, her chatter filling the silences with practiced ease. The four suspects, however, were the true focus of Miss Marple's attention, each revealing themselves in ways they scarcely realized. Mr. Reginald Voss, the stamp dealer, sat nearest the window, his thin frame angled toward the light as if seeking escape. He was a man in his late 40s, with a sallow complexion and eyes that darted like a ferret's, sharp and calculating. His suit, though well cut, showed signs of wear at the cuffs, and his fingers, stained faintly with ink, toyed incessantly with a silver cigarette case. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a clipped precision, as if every word were weighed for profit. "A fine day for a gathering, Colonel," he remarked, his gaze flickering to the cabinet. "I trust your collection is secure after recent events?" The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of the Colonel's jaw. Dr. Henry Langston, the Colonel's friend and fellow philatelist, occupied the sofa with an air of forced joviality. A robust man in his 60s, with a florid face and a shock of gray hair, he laughed too loudly at Mrs. Bantry's jest about the village fete, his hands gesticulating expansively. "Oh, Dolly, you're too much," he boomed, but his eyes, when they met the Colonel's, held a trace of unease. He wore a tweed jacket that strained slightly at the buttons, and his tie, a garish shade of green, clashed with the room's muted tones. Miss Marple recalled a village butcher who laughed just so when questioned about short waits, and she wondered what Dr. Langston's hearty exterior might conceal. Miss Clara Thorne, the appraiser, sat primly in a high-backed chair, her posture as rigid as the steel-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose. She was a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps 40, perhaps older, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun that accentuated the angular lines of her face. Her gray dress was immaculate, devoid of ornament, and her hands rested in her lap, still as stone. When Mrs. Bantry offered her a scone, she declined with a polite but curt nod, her voice cool and measured. "I prefer to keep my attention on the matter at hand," she said, her eyes briefly meeting the Colonel's before returning to her teacup. Miss Marple noted the precision of her movements, like those of a village school mistress who once hid her ambitions behind a mask of propriety. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, the guest, was the most animated of the group, her laughter like a chime as she complimented Mrs. Bantry's china. A widow in her early 50s, she possessed a fading beauty that she wielded with practiced charm. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her silk dress, though stylish, hinted at expense beyond her means. She leaned forward to accept a sandwich, her emerald bracelet catching the light, and her conversation danced from the London theatre to the delights of the countryside. Yet Miss Marple observed a certain restlessness in her movements, a tendency to glance at the others when she thought herself unobserved. "Such a lovely home," she murmured, her eyes lingering on the locked cabinet. "You must be so proud of your treasures, Colonel." Her tone was warm, but Miss Marple sensed a calculation beneath it, reminiscent of a village widow who had once charmed her way into secrets she had no right to know. The conversation turned, at the Colonel's prompting, to the subject of stamps. He spoke with enthusiasm about his collection, carefully avoiding mention of the blue Mauritius, though the absence of the topic was as conspicuous as a missing tooth. "I've been thinking of expanding my penny blacks," he said, his voice a touch too hearty. "Perhaps you, Mr. Voss, could recommend a source?" Voss's eyes lit up, and he launched into a discourse on the availability of early Victorian issues, his hands gesturing with renewed vigor. Miss Marple noted how his enthusiasm seemed to mask a deeper tension, his fingers twitching when the Colonel mentioned the security of his collection. Dr. Langston joined in, his voice booming as he recounted a recent acquisition of a Cape of Good Hope triangular. "Not in the same league as your Mauritius, of course," he said, with a laugh that rang hollow. "But a fine piece all the same." His eyes flicked to Voss, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting look of rivalry, quickly masked by another hearty chuckle. She thought of two village boys who had once quarreled over a cricket bat, their smiles hiding a deeper grudge. Miss Thorne, when pressed, offered a dry assessment of the market for rare stamps, her words precise and devoid of warmth. "The value lies in authenticity," she said, adjusting her spectacles. "Too many collectors are swayed by sentiment rather than fact." Her gaze rested briefly on the Colonel, and Miss Marple wondered if the remark was a subtle jab, or merely her nature asserting itself. She recalled a village librarian who spoke in just such clipped tones when guarding her domain, her sharpness a shield for secrets. Mrs. Carver, for her part, professed ignorance of philately, her laughter light as she admitted to finding stamps rather dull, though terribly clever. Yet when the Colonel opened the cabinet to display a lesser album, one carefully chosen to avoid the empty sleeve of the blue Mauritius, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Carver's eyes linger on the pages with a curiosity that belied her words. "How fascinating," she murmured, leaning closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Miss Marple thought of a village seamstress who had once admired a neighbor's lace with just such an air, only to be found with it in her possession days later. As tea progressed, Miss Marple steered the conversation with gentle questions, her voice so soft it seemed almost incidental. "You must see such interesting collections, Mr. Voss," she said, her needles clicking rhythmically. Do you ever come across stamps that disappear, shall we say? Voss's cigarette case snapped shut with a sharp click, and he offered a thin smile. It's rare, Miss Marple, but not unheard of. Collectors can be careless. His tone was smooth, but his eyes avoided hers, and she noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. To Dr. Langston, she remarked on the camaraderie among collectors. It must be such a comfort to share your passion with friends like the Colonel, she said. Langston's laugh was a shade too loud. Oh, Arthur and I go way back, no secrets between us. Yet his hand tightened around his teacup, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets a man like Langston might keep, even from an old friend. Miss Thorne responded to a question about stamp valuation with a lecture on the importance of provenance, her words as crisp as the autumn air. A stamp without a history is merely paper, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. Miss Marple smiled, thinking of a village spinster who had once guarded her family's history with similar zeal, only to reveal more than she intended in her fervor. Mrs. Carver, when asked about her travels, spoke of Paris and Rome with a vivacity that charmed the room. Yet her answers grew vague when Miss Marple inquired about her late husband's interests. Oh, he was a businessman, always busy with figures, she said, waving a hand. I left such things to him. Her smile was radiant, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers, like those of a village girl caught in a half-truth about a borrowed shawl. As the gathering drew to a close, the suspects rose to take their leave, each offering polite farewells. Voss lingered by the cabinet, his hand brushing the lock as if by accident. Langston clapped the Colonel on the shoulder, his bonhomie a touch too effusive. Miss Thorne departed with a curt nod, her spectacles glinting in the firelight. Mrs. Carver pressed Mrs. Bantry's hand, her thanks effusive, but her eyes darted once more to the cabinet before she left. Miss Marple remained, sipping her tea as the Colonel locked the cabinet with a flourish. Well, Jane, he said, turning to her, what do you make of them? A rum lot, if you ask me. She smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. People are rarely what they seem, Colonel, she said, but they always betray themselves, in the smallest ways. A glance, a gesture, a word too carefully chosen. We shall see who has left the deepest mark. As she walked home through the village, the evening air cool against her cheeks, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of impressions. Voss's nervous hands, Langston's forced laughter, Thorne's icy precision, Carver's calculated charm. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the crime. She thought of a village fete where a stolen cake had revealed a thief through a crumb on a sleeve, and she knew that the blue Mauritius, too, would leave its trace. The suspects had assembled, and in their words and silences, Miss Marple had begun to glimpse the shape of the truth. Chapter 3. The Locked Study. The morning after the tea gathering, Miss Jane Marple walked the short distance from her cottage to Bantry Hall, her sturdy shoes crunching on the gravel path. The air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, and a faint mist clung to the hedgerows, lending the village an air of quiet secrecy. She carried her black handbag, its contents as unremarkable as her appearance, though her mind was anything but. The puzzle of the missing blue Mauritius stamp had taken root, and she was determined to examine the scene of the crime with her own eyes. Colonel Bantry met her at the door, his face a mixture of relief and impatience. "You're a godsend, Miss Marple," he said, ushering her inside. I've been over the study a dozen times, and I'm no closer to understanding how that stamp vanished. It's like a conjurer's trick." Mrs. Bantry hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "Oh, Jane, it's dreadful. Arthur's barely slept, and I'm half afraid he'll accuse the servants next." Miss Marple smiled gently, patting her friend's arm. "Let us not leap to accusations, Dolly. A clear head and a careful look will do wonders." The Colonel led her through the hall, past portraits of stern-faced Bantry ancestors, to the study at the rear of the house. It was a masculine room, paneled in dark oak, with a heavy desk dominating the center and bookshelves lining the walls. A single window, framed by thick curtains, overlooked the garden, its latch gleaming in the morning light. A glass-fronted cabinet stood against one wall, now housing the stamp albums under a new, formidable lock. The desk, polished to a mirror-like sheen, bore no clutter save for an inkstand, a blotter, and a small brass paperweight shaped like a horse. "This is where it happened," the Colonel said, gesturing to the desk. "I left the album here that evening, open to the page with the blue Mauritius. I'd been showing it to Langston earlier, and I meant to put it away. But I was called to the drawing room for drinks. When I returned the next morning, the stamp was gone. Empty sleeve, not a trace of it. The door was locked, the key in my pocket, and the window latched tight." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room with a deceptive mildness. She stepped to the desk, her fingers brushing the edge where the album had lain. "You're certain the album was untouched otherwise? No other stamps missing?" "Not a one," the Colonel confirmed. "I checked every page, just the blue Mauritius, plucked clean out of its sleeve. It's madness, Miss Marple. How could anyone get in here?" She moved to the window, her gaze lingering on the latch. It was a sturdy brass fitting, showing no signs of force, but she noted a faint smudge on the sill, barely visible against the dark wood. "This window," she said. "You're sure it was latched that night?" "Positive," the Colonel said. "I check it every evening, habit from my army days. No one could have come through without breaking the glass, and it's intact." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "And the key to the door, did it leave your possession at any point?" "Never," he said firmly, patting his waistcoat pocket. "It's always on me, or in the safe at night. No one could have got hold of it." She nodded, her mind turning to a village locksmith who had once been persuaded to make a duplicate key for a petty thief, all for the price of a pint. "People are resourceful, Colonel," she murmured. "Let us consider the room itself." She knelt with surprising agility for her age, peering at the floor beneath the desk. The carpet was thick, but a faint indentation near one leg caught her eye, as if something heavy had been set down briefly. She straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. Next, she approached the cabinet, now locked tight. "You moved the albums here after the theft?" she asked. "Yes," the Colonel said. "Didn't want to risk another loss, but that night the album was on the desk, not in the cabinet. I should have been more careful, dash it." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the desk, where a faint scratch, no longer than a fingernail, marred the polished surface near the edge. "Curious," she said softly, running her finger along it. "This mark wasn't here before, was it?" The Colonel peered at it, frowning. "Can't say I noticed it before. Could have been there for ages. Desks seen plenty of use." "Perhaps," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She thought of a village carpenter who had once left a telltale nick in a stolen jewelry box, betraying his crime. Small marks, she knew, could speak volumes. She turned her attention to the room's other details, her eyes moving methodically from the bookshelves to the fireplace, where a few embers glowed faintly. A brass poker rested against the hearth, and she noted its position, slightly askew, as if it had been moved and not quite replaced. "Do you often use the fireplace, Colonel?" she asked. "Not much this time of year," he said. "Lit it that evening for the ambiance, with guests about. Why do you ask?" "No reason," she said lightly, but her mind filed away the detail. She recalled a village girl who had hidden a stolen brooch in a chimney, thinking it safe from prying eyes. The study, she sensed, held secrets beyond its locked door and latched window. "Tell me about that evening," she said, settling into a chair by the desk, her hands folded in her lap. "Who came and went, and when?" The colonel paced as he recounted the events. "It was a busy night. Voss arrived first around 4 to discuss an auction. We went over the album in here, and he was particularly keen on the blue Mauritius, kept saying it could fetch a fortune in Zurich. Left the study together, and I locked it. Langston came by around 6, wanted to see the collection again. He's always poking about, but I trust him. We had a whiskey in here, and I showed him the stamp. He left the study before dinner, and I locked up again. Miss Thorne was here earlier in the day, appraising some Victorian issues, but she was gone by evening. Mrs. Carver didn't come in here? As far as I know, she was with Dolly in the drawing room most of the time." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind sorting through the timeline. "And you're certain no one else entered the study after you locked it?" "Not a soul," the colonel said. "The servants were busy with dinner, and Dolly and I were with the guests. I checked the study before bed around 11, and everything seemed fine. It wasn't until morning that I found the stamp gone." She nodded, her eyes drifting back to the smudge on the windowsill. "And the album was open when you found it?" "Yes, to the page with the Mauritius. I must have left it that way after showing Langston. Careless of me, but the room was locked, so I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "May I see the album, Colonel?" Just to understand how the stamp was kept. He unlocked the cabinet, retrieving the album with a reverence that spoke of his passion. He opened it to the page in question, revealing an empty plastic sleeve, its edges pristine. "Here it was," he said, his voice heavy. "Mounted carefully, not a crease or tear. Whoever took it knew what they were doing. No damage to the sleeve." She examined it closely, noting the sleeve's clarity and the faint adhesive residue where the stamp had been secured. "A delicate operation," she murmured. "Not the work of an amateur." She thought of a village seamstress who had once unpicked a rival's embroidery with surgical precision, leaving no trace of her sabotage. Closing the album, she handed it back to the colonel. "You've been most helpful," she said. "I should like to speak with your guests again, perhaps individually. People reveal more when they're not performing for an audience." The colonel's face brightened. "You've got a theory, haven't you? I knew you'd get to the bottom of this." "Not a theory, Colonel," she said, her smile enigmatic. "Merely a sense of possibilities. People are like books, you see. Open them carefully, and the truth spills out." As she left the study, her eyes lingered on the scratch, the smudge, and the poker, each a silent witness to the crime. The locked study was not impregnable, she knew. It was a stage where human nature had played its part. She thought of a village shopkeeper who had once sworn his till was secure, only for a clever child to reveal its hidden flaw. The blue Mauritius, she was certain, had not vanished by magic, but by the hand of someone who knew the room's secrets, and she intended to find them. Chapter 4. The Dealer's Ambition. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the tidy lanes of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm that matched the steady turning of her thoughts. The mystery of the missing blue Mauritius stamp had deepened with her inspection of the Colonel's study, and she knew the next step was to probe the suspect's motives, beginning with Mr. Reginald Voss, the stamp dealer. His nervous demeanor at the tea gathering, coupled with his intimate knowledge of the stamp's value, made him a natural starting point. She had arranged, through a discreet note delivered by the Bantry's maid, to meet him at the village tea shop, a neutral ground where tongues might loosen over a pot of Earl Grey. The tea shop, a quaint establishment with gingham curtains and a bell that jingled over the door, was nearly empty when Miss Marple arrived. She chose a corner table, her black handbag at her side, and ordered a modest tea for two. Mr. Voss entered precisely on time, his wiry frame moving with a jerky energy, as if propelled by some inner spring. His suit, though pressed, showed the same worn cuffs she had noticed before, and his sharp eyes darted about the room before settling on her. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a tight smile as he sat, "this is an unexpected pleasure. I trust the Colonel's loss is weighing on your mind?" "Indeed, Mr. Voss," she replied, her voice soft and disarming, as she poured tea with the grace of long practice. "A loss like the blue Mauritius is no small matter. You, of all people, must understand its significance." Her eyes, mild but piercing, watched his reaction over the rim of her cup. Voss's fingers twitched toward his cigarette case, then retreated, as if he thought better of it in her presence. "Oh, I do," he said, his tone clipped. "It's a collector's dream, one of the rarest stamps in the world. I sold it to the Colonel myself, you know, back in 2022. Cost him a pretty penny, but worth every shilling." His smile flickered, and Miss Marple noted the faint strain in it, like a village grocer she once knew who smiled too brightly when his scales were questioned. "You must deal in many such treasures," she said, passing him a scone with a gesture that invited confidences. "It cannot be easy, managing a business with such valuable items. The market must be quite unpredictable." Voss hesitated, his hand pausing over the scone. "It has its challenges," he admitted, his voice careful. "The stamp trade isn't what it was. Collectors are fickle, and auctions are cutthroat. My shop in London, well, it's seen better days." He took a sip of tea, his eyes avoiding hers, and Miss Marple sensed the weight of unspoken troubles. She leaned forward slightly, her tone as gentle as a village gossip sharing a harmless tidbit. "I imagine a stamp like the blue Mauritius could change a man's fortunes. I heard talk of a recent auction in Zurich, quite a sum for a similar piece, wasn't it?" Voss's hand jerked, nearly upsetting his cup, and he covered it with a forced laugh. "You've a sharp ear, Miss Marple. Yes, a blue Mauritius fetched nearly 20,000 at Sotheby's last month. A fortune, as you say." His fingers resumed their restless dance, and she noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the coolness of the tea shop. "It must be tempting," she continued, her voice as soft as the rustle of her knitting, "to handle such wealth daily, yet see so little of it yourself. A man in your position, with debts perhaps, might find it—" difficult to resist certain opportunities. Voss's eyes narrowed, and for a moment his polished facade slipped, revealing a flash of defensiveness. "I'm a professional, Miss Marple," he said sharply. "I've built my reputation on trust. I'd never stoop to stealing from a client, least of all the Colonel. He's been good to me over the years." His words were firm, but his hands betrayed him, clenching the edge of the table as if anchoring himself against her scrutiny. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as benign as a village spinster admiring a neighbor's roses. "Of course, Mr. Voss, I meant no offense, but you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity. People do act in surprising ways when pressed. I once knew a shopkeeper in St. Mary Mead, a respectable man, who altered his ledgers just to keep his business afloat. A small thing, he thought, but it unraveled him in the end." Voss's face paled slightly, and he busied himself with his tea, though he drank little. "I assure you," he said, his voice steadier now, "my business may be struggling, but I've no need to resort to such measures. Besides, stealing the blue Mauritius would be foolish. It's too rare, too traceable. Only a madman would try to sell it." "Or a very clever one," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, as she buttered a scone. She thought of a village poacher who had once sold stolen pheasants under the guise of legitimate trade, his cleverness undone by a single feather left in a buyer's cart. "Tell me, Mr. Voss, were you alone with the album at any point that evening? The Colonel mentioned you were discussing an auction." Voss's eyes flicked to hers, then away. "Briefly, yes, we looked over his collection in the study. He showed me the Mauritius. As always, loves to gloat over it." He gave a thin smile. "But we left together, and he locked the door. I never went back." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting, which she had produced from her handbag with the ease of habit. "And the key? Did you handle it at all? Perhaps when the Colonel was distracted?" Voss's smile vanished, replaced by a look of indignation. "Really, Miss Marple, you go too far. I'm no pickpocket. The Colonel had the key in his pocket, as he always does. I couldn't have touched it, even if I'd wanted to." His voice rose slightly, drawing a curious glance from the tea shop's proprietress, and he lowered it quickly, as if aware of his slip. "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, her eyes never leaving his face. "But you'll understand my need to ask. A stamp like that doesn't vanish by itself, and you were one of the few near the study that evening. It's curious, isn't it, how such a small thing can cause such a stir?" Voss relaxed slightly, though his fingers still toyed with his cigarette case. "Curious, yes, but I'm as baffled as the Colonel. If I were to guess, I'd say someone with access to the house, perhaps a servant, saw an opportunity. Stamps are small, easy to hide." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "A servant, perhaps, though I wonder if a servant would know the value of one stamp over another. The blue Mauritius was taken, but nothing else. That suggests a certain expertise, don't you think?" Voss shrugged, his composure returning. "Possibly, or luck. Thieves don't always know what they're stealing." He glanced at his watch, a subtle hint of impatience. "If there's nothing else, Miss Marple, I should be getting back. I've a train to catch to London this evening." She smiled, setting her knitting aside. "You've been most patient, Mr. Voss. One last question, if I may. Have you ever made a duplicate key for a client? To help with their collections, perhaps?" His eyes widened, and for a moment she thought he might protest. Instead, he laughed, a brittle sound. "A duplicate key? No, Miss Marple, that's not my line. I deal in stamps, not locksmithing." He rose, offering a curt bow. "Good day, and I hope you find your thief." As he left, the bell jingling behind him, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sifting through his words. His denial had been swift, but his unease was palpable, like a village baker she had once questioned about a missing loaf, his protests too vehement to be entirely true. The mention of a duplicate key had struck a nerve, she was certain, and the smudge of wax on the Colonel's windowsill loomed larger in her thoughts. Wax, she knew, could hold an impression as surely as a heart could hold ambition. She recalled Voss's mention of the Zurich auction, the staggering sum for a blue Mauritius, and his admission of a struggling business. Ambition, she thought, was a powerful force, one that could drive a man to desperate acts. She remembered a village curate who had once pocketed collection funds to save his sister's home, his guilt betrayed by the tremble in his hands. Voss's hands, too, had trembled, and his eyes had avoided hers when she pressed him about the key. As she paid for the tea and stepped into the crisp afternoon, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. Voss's ambition was clear, his business teetered on the brink, and the blue Mauritius was a lifeline. But was he clever enough to steal it without leaving a trace? Or had his ambition made him careless, leaving the scratch on the desk, the smudge on the sill? She thought of the Colonel's key, always in his pocket, and wondered how a man like Voss might have gained access. A moment of distraction, a sleight of hand. She had seen such tricks before, in the unlikeliest of places. Walking home, her shawl drawn about her shoulders, Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Dr. Langston's envy, Miss Thorne's precision, Mrs. Carver's charm. Each had their own motives, their own opportunities. But Voss's ambition burned brightest in her thoughts, a flame that could consume both him and the truth. She would need to watch him closely, for ambition, like a stamp, left its mark in the smallest details. Chapter 5. The Friend's Envy. The soft glow of evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village houses casting long shadows as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the church spire. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the wrought-iron table beside her, her knitting needles idle for once, as she pondered the mystery of the blue Mauritius. Her conversation with Mr. Voss had revealed the sharp edge of his ambition, but her thoughts now turned to Dr. Henry Langston, the Colonel's old friend and fellow collector. His boisterous laughter at the tea gathering had rung false, like a cracked bell, and Miss Marple suspected that beneath his jovial exterior lay a motive as potent as envy. She had arranged to meet him the next morning, ostensibly to discuss the village library fund, but her true purpose was to probe the heart of a man who coveted what his friend possessed. Dr. Langston arrived at her cottage promptly at 10, his heavy tread announcing him before he knocked. He filled the doorway, his florid face beaming with a cheer that seemed to strain at the seams. His tweed jacket, stretched tight across his broad shoulders, bore a faint stain of cigar ash, and his green tie clashed as garishly as ever with the muted tones of her parlor. "Miss Marple," he boomed, shaking her hand with a vigor that made her teacup rattle. "A pleasure to see you, even under these grim circumstances. The Colonel's loss, eh? Shocking business." "Quite shocking," she agreed, gesturing to a chintz-covered armchair. "Do sit down, Doctor. Langston, I thought we might chat about the library fund, but I confess, the Colonel's misfortune is much on my mind." Her voice was gentle, her eyes mild, but they missed nothing. The slight tightening of his smile, the way his fingers drummed on his knee as he settled into the chair. She poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot, her movements as unhurried as a summer afternoon. "You and the Colonel have been friends for many years. I understand," she said, passing him a cup. "It must be a comfort to share your passion for stamps, though I imagine it can stir a touch of rivalry too, with such rare treasures at stake." Langston laughed, a loud, hearty sound that filled the room but failed to reach his eyes. "Rivalry? Oh, nothing serious, Miss Marple. Arthur and I go back to our army days. Shared a tent in the Boer War, you know. We've always swapped stories about our collections, but it's all in good fun. His blue Mauritius, though, well, that's a prize I'd give my eye teeth for." He chuckled again, but his hand tightened around the teacup, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his fingers, like those of a village farmer she once knew who laughed off his envy of a neighbor's prize bull, only to sabotage its pen. "You were in the study with him that evening, were you not?" she asked, her tone as light as if she were inquiring about the weather. "The Colonel mentioned you admired the stamp." "Oh, yes," Langston said, leaning back with an air of nonchalance. "Arthur loves showing off that Mauritius. We had a whiskey, talked shop, and I had a good look at his album. Fine piece, that stamp, flawless margins, perfect postmark. But I left before dinner, and he locked the door behind me. Nothing out of the ordinary." His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked to the window, as if seeking escape from her gentle scrutiny. Miss Marple nodded, her needles now clicking softly as she resumed her knitting, the lavender shawl growing steadily in her lap. "It must be a trial, being so close to such a treasure yet never owning it. I recall a young man in our village, a gardener, who coveted his employer's roses. He never stole them, mind you, but his longing was plain in every glance." Langston's laugh was sharper this time, almost a bark. "Coveting? Good heavens, Miss Marple, you make me sound like a villain in a penny dreadful. I've got my own collection, you know, some fine Cape triangulars, a few early Canadians. I don't need Arthur's stamp to feel complete." Yet his fingers drummed faster, and she saw a flush creep up his neck, like that of a village boy caught fibbing about a broken window. She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving his face. "Of course, Dr. Langston, but collections have a way of stirring the heart, don't they? The blue Mauritius is no ordinary stamp. I understand it could fetch a fortune, enough to rival even the finest. Collections." His smile faltered, and for a moment his jovial mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something darker. Resentment, perhaps, or longing. "It's valuable, no question," he said, his voice lower now. "But I'm no thief. Arthur's my friend, and I'd never do him wrong. Besides, stealing a stamp like that is a fool's game, too rare to sell without drawing attention." He leaned forward, his tone earnest, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, darting to the teapot instead. "Quite so," she said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Though I wonder if envy, not theft, might drive a man to act rashly. A moment of weakness, perhaps, to hold what he cannot have. I once knew a curate in our village who borrowed a book from the vicar's library just to feel its weight in his hands. He meant to return it, but intentions are fragile things." Langston's face reddened, and he set his cup down with a clink. "I don't follow you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. I was in the study, yes, but I didn't touch the stamp. Arthur locked the door, and I went to the drawing room with the others. You can ask Dolly. She saw me there all evening. Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile unwavering. I'm sure Mrs. Bantry would confirm it, but you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity. Did you notice anything unusual that evening? Perhaps someone lingering near the study, or a moment when the colonel was distracted? He frowned, as if searching his memory, though she suspected he was weighing his words. Can't say I did, he said at last. It was a lively evening. Mrs. Carver was charming everyone. Voss was droning on about auctions, and Miss Thorne was her usual frosty self. I was too busy enjoying my whiskey to notice much else. He forced a grin, but it sat uneasily on his face, like a village shopkeeper's smile when questioned about a missing parcel. She nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically. And the album? Did you handle it yourself, or did the colonel show you the stamp? Arthur showed it, Langston said quickly. He's particular about his albums, you know. I looked, admired, and that was that. Didn't touch a thing. His voice was firm, but his fingers resumed their drumming, and Miss Marple thought of a village boy who swore he hadn't touched a stolen apple, yet left a trail of juice on his chin. She set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap. You're very loyal to the colonel, she said, her tone warm but probing. It's rare to find such friendship, though I wonder, did you ever feel a pang, seeing his blue Mauritius when your own collection lacks such a gem? Langston's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought he might bristle. Instead, he laughed again, though it sounded forced. A pang? Maybe once or twice, in jest, but I'm happy with my lot, Miss Marple. Arthur's got his Mauritius, I've got my triangulars. We each have our triumphs. He rose, smoothing his jacket. Now, about that library fund. Shall we discuss it, or is this all about stamps? She smiled, rising to see him out. The library can wait, Doctor. Langston, you've been most helpful. I do hope we'll find the colonel's treasure soon. It would be a pity for such a friendship to be clouded by loss. As he left, his heavy steps echoing down the path, Miss Marple returned to her tea, her mind sifting through his words. His envy was palpable, like a village gardener's longing for a rival's blooms, and his quick denials only sharpened her suspicions. The colonel had locked the study, he said, but envy could unlock doors in subtler ways. She thought of the scratch on the desk, the smudge on the sill, and wondered if Langston's visit to the study had been as innocent as he claimed. A moment alone, a fleeting impulse. She had seen such moments undo men before, like a village clerk who borrowed a ledger to settle a grudge. Her thoughts drifted to the other suspects, Voss's ambition, Thorne's precision, Carver's charm, but Langston's envy lingered, a dark thread in the tapestry. She recalled a village fete where a man's envy of a rival's prize marrow had led to a petty act of sabotage, revealed by a single careless footprint. Langston's footprints, she sensed, were there in the study, if only she could find them. As she picked up her knitting, the needles resumed their steady rhythm, mirroring the quiet certainty that the truth, like a stamp, would bear the mark of its thief. Chapter 6. The Appraiser's Precision. The morning mist had barely lifted from St. Mary Mead when Miss Jane Marple set out for the village post office, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and the quiet streets seemed to hold their breath, as if sensing the undercurrents of the mystery she was unraveling. Her conversation with Dr. Langston had sharpened her sense of his envy, but now her thoughts turned to Miss Clara Thorne, the appraiser, whose icy demeanor and meticulous nature suggested a mind capable of calculated acts. Miss Marple had arranged to meet her at the Bantry estate, where Miss Thorne had agreed to return under the pretense of reviewing additional stamps for valuation. In truth, Miss Marple sought to probe the depths of a woman whose precision might conceal more than it revealed. At Bantry Hall, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a flutter of nervous energy, her hands smoothing her apron as she led Miss Marple to the drawing-room. "Oh, Jane, you're a marvel for coming," she said, her voice low. "Arthur's pacing like a caged lion, and Miss Thorne's already here, cool as a cucumber. I don't know how you stay so calm." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "Calmness, Dolly, is merely a matter of perspective. Now, where is our appraiser?" Miss Thorne sat by the window, her posture as rigid as the oak chair she occupied, her gray dress unadorned save for a single silver brooch. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her steel-rimmed spectacles glinted as she turned to acknowledge Miss Marple's arrival. "Good morning," she said, her voice as crisp as the autumn air. "Mrs. Bantry mentioned you wished to discuss the Colonel's collection. I trust this is about the unfortunate loss?" Her tone held no warmth, only a faint edge of impatience, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands rested motionless in her lap, as if schooled against betrayal. "Indeed, Miss Thorne," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair opposite, her knitting needles emerging from her handbag with practiced ease. "The blue Mauritius is a great loss, and I'm helping the Colonel in my small way. You, with your expertise, must have seen many such rarities. It's a pity one should vanish so mysteriously." Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the slightest flicker in Miss Thorne's composed facade. Miss Thorne adjusted her spectacles, her movements precise. "A pity, yes," she said. "The blue Mauritius is a singular piece, flawless provenance, impeccable condition. Its loss is a blow to the philatelic world, though I suspect the Colonel feels it more personally." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and Miss Marple thought of a village schoolmistress who had once corrected a child's grammar with the same unyielding precision, her severity masking a deeper discontent. She poured tea from the tray Mrs. Bantry had provided, offering a cup to Miss Thorne, who accepted it with a nod. "Your work must be fascinating," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "Valuing such treasures requires not only knowledge but trust. I imagine it places you in delicate situations, handling items of such worth." Miss Thorne's eyes met hers, cool and unblinking. "It requires discipline," she said. "I verify authenticity, assess condition, and provide estimates. Sentiment has no place in it. Collectors like the Colonel often overvalue their possessions emotionally, but I deal in facts." Her words were clipped, each one measured, and Miss Marple noted the absence of warmth, like a village librarian who guarded her books with a zeal that bordered on obsession. "Facts are so reassuring," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as the tea. "Though I wonder, have you ever encountered a situation where a stamp disappeared, perhaps misplaced by a collector or taken by someone who knew its value?" Her question hung in the air, innocent yet pointed, and she watched Miss Thorne's reaction with the patience of a gardener awaiting a bud's bloom. Miss Thorne's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup, though her expression remained impassive. "Misplacements are common," she said. "Collectors can be careless, leaving albums unattended or misfiling stamps. Theft, however, is rare. Most thieves lack the knowledge to target something as specific as the blue Mauritius." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Though I suppose someone with expertise could attempt it, if they were foolish enough to think they could sell it undetected." Miss Marple nodded, her needles never pausing. "Foolish, perhaps, but temptation can make fools of us all. I recall a woman in our village, a seamstress, who was so precise with her stitches that no one suspected her of borrowing a client's silk. It was her precision, you see, that made her so convincing, until a thread gave her away." She smiled, her eyes soft but searching, and saw a flicker of unease in Miss Thorne's gaze, quickly suppressed. "I assure you, Miss Marple," Miss Thorne said, her voice steady, "my precision is my reputation. I was in the Colonel's study that afternoon, valuing his Victorian issues, but I left well before evening. The album was on the desk, and the blue Mauritius was intact when I saw it. I had no opportunity to take it, nor any desire." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight rigidity in her posture, like a village governess who had once denied tampering with a rival's lesson plans, only to be betrayed by a smudged ink blot. "You were alone with the album, then?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "The Colonel mentioned you spent some time in the study." "For a short while," Miss Thorne admitted, her eyes flicking to the window. "The Colonel stepped out to answer a telephone call. I continued my work, but I locked the door when I left as he requested. The key was returned to him immediately." Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple sensed a careful selection of words, as if each were chosen to deflect scrutiny. "Of course," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "And you noticed nothing unusual? No one lingering near the study, perhaps, or anything amiss with the room?" Miss Thorne shook her head, her movements precise. "Nothing. The study was orderly, the window latched, the desk clear except for the album. I'm not in the habit of noticing irrelevancies." Her tone held a faint rebuke, and Miss Marple thought of a village clerk who had once dismissed a missing ledger as irrelevant, only to be found with it in his attic. She set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap. "Your memory is remarkable, Miss Thorne. It must be a great asset in your work. Though I wonder, did you ever feel tempted by the treasures you handle? Not to steal, of course, but to possess something so rare, even for a moment?" Her question was soft, almost whimsical, but her eyes were keen, watching for the crack in Miss Thorne's armor. Miss Thorne's lips tightened, and for a moment her composure wavered, like a village spinster caught off guard by a pointed question about her past. "Temptation is irrelevant," she said. "I value stamps, not own them. My satisfaction comes from accuracy, not possession." Yet her fingers adjusted her spectacles unnecessarily, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, like that of a village teacher who had once fidgeted when questioned about a missing exam paper. "I see," Miss Marple said, her smile as benign as ever. "Though I heard you recently declined a lucrative position. Something abroad, was it? That must have been a difficult decision, with such opportunities at stake." Miss Thorne's eyes widened briefly, then narrowed. "You're well informed, Miss Marple," she said, her voice colder now. "It was a personal matter, nothing to do with this. I prefer to work independently." She set her teacup down with a faint clink, signaling her desire to end the conversation. Miss Marple rose, her movements unhurried. "You've been most helpful, Miss Thorne. Precision is a rare gift, though it can make one vulnerable in its own way. I once knew a woman in our village, so precise with her accounts that no one suspected her of skimming the church funds until a single miscalculation betrayed her." Miss Thorne stood, her expression unreadable. "I have no such vulnerabilities, Miss Marple. Good day." She left with a curt nod, her footsteps echoing in the hall, and Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the encounter. As Mrs. Bantry bustled in, full of questions, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts on Miss Thorne's precision. It was a shield, she sensed, but one that might hide a flaw. The appraiser's brief time alone in the study, her access to the album, and her guarded response about the declined job suggested a woman with secrets. Miss Marple recalled the wax smudge on the windowsill, the scratch on the desk, and wondered if Miss Thorne's meticulous nature had overlooked a detail or deliberately left one. She thought of a village nurse who had once measured medicines with such precision that no one suspected her of tampering, until a single drop too many revealed her intent. The threads of the mystery were tightening: Voss's ambition, Langston's envy, and now Thorne's precision, each a facet of human nature that could lead to theft. As she picked up her knitting, Miss Marple felt the pattern emerging, like a village quilt whose stitches told a story of betrayal, if only one knew where to look. Chapter 7. The Guest's Charm. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor as she sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles lying idle for the moment. The mystery of the blue Mauritius stamp had woven a complex web, and her conversations with Mr. Voss, Dr. Langston, and Miss Thorne had illuminated their respective motives: ambition, envy, and precision. Now her thoughts turned to Mrs. Evelyn Carver, the charming widow whose effusive warmth at the Bantry's tea had seemed just a shade too practiced. Miss Marple had invited her for a visit under the guise of discussing a charity bazaar, knowing that a woman like Mrs. Carver would respond to the flattery of being asked for her social expertise. In truth, Miss Marple intended to peel back the layers of charm to glimpse what lay beneath. Mrs. Carver arrived promptly at 4, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her silk dress whispering of expense despite its subtle signs of wear. A slightly frayed hem, a faded sheen at the elbows. Her emerald bracelet caught the light as she extended a gloved hand, her smile as radiant as the summer sun. "Miss Marple, how delightful!" she exclaimed, her voice musical. "I'm so flattered you thought of me for your bazaar. I do love organizing such things. Brings a bit of sparkle to the village, don't you think?" Her eyes sparkled too, but Miss Marple noted a fleeting wariness, like that of a village girl who had once charmed her way out of a scolding, only to be caught with a stolen ribbon. "Do sit down, Mrs. Carver," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a cushioned chair by the tea-table, where a pot of Darjeeling and a plate of shortbread awaited. "I'm sure your flair for such events will be invaluable, but I confess the Colonel's loss has been much on my mind. A rare stamp, taken so mysteriously. It's quite unsettling." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her eyes were keen, watching the widow's reaction as she poured the tea. Mrs. Carver's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, brighter than before. "Oh, it's dreadful, isn't it?" she said, accepting her cup with a graceful nod. "Poor Colonel Bantry, so proud of his collection. I know nothing about stamps myself, but I could see how much it meant to him. To think someone would steal it, why, it's positively wicked." Her tone was laced with sympathy, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her hand as she stirred her tea, reminiscent of a village widow who had once feigned shock over a missing brooch, her nerves betraying her. "You were at the house that evening, I believe," Miss Marple said, her needles now clicking softly as she resumed her knitting, the lavender shawl growing steadily. "It must have been a lively gathering with so many interesting people. Did you notice anything unusual? Perhaps someone near the study?" Mrs. Carver tilted her head, her expression thoughtful, though her eyes darted briefly to the window. "Let me see," she said, her voice light. "I spent most of the evening with dear Mrs. Bantry in the drawing-room. Such a charming hostess. We talked of London and the theater, and oh, all sorts of nonsense. I don't recall anyone slipping away, though I wasn't watching closely. I'm afraid I'm not much help, Miss Marple. I was too busy enjoying myself." She laughed, a chime-like sound, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers toyed with her bracelet, like a village girl fidgeting with a stolen trinket. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. "Though I wonder, did you see the Colonel's album at all? He mentioned showing it to Dr. Langston, and I thought perhaps you might have caught a glimpse, being so curious about the house." Mrs. Carver's laugh was a touch too bright. "Curious? Oh, I suppose I am. The Bantry's home is so lovely, all those treasures tucked away. But stamps? I'm hopeless with them. I did peek at the album when the Colonel brought it out after dinner, just to be polite. Such tiny things, aren't they, for all the fuss?" Her hand fluttered to her throat, and Miss Marple saw the bracelet slide slightly, revealing a faint mark on her wrist, as if it had been worn too tightly, a detail that reminded her of a village seamstress who hid a pilfered ring under a glove. "You have an eye for beautiful things," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but probing. "That bracelet, for instance, it's quite striking. A gift, perhaps, from your late husband." Her question was innocent, but her eyes missed nothing, noting the sudden stillness in Mrs. Carver's posture. "Oh, this?" Mrs. Carver touched the bracelet, her smile tightening. "Yes, from my dear Charles. He had such taste, though I'm afraid his business dealings left us in rather a pinch. I keep it for sentiment, you know." Her voice was airy, but Miss Marple caught the slight catch in it, like that of a village widow who had once spoken too fondly of a gift that later proved stolen. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking rhythmically, "to maintain such elegance after such a loss. I've known women in our village who faced similar struggles, clinging to their pride despite empty purses. One, I recall, sold a neighbor's silver to keep up appearances, though she wept for her honor afterward." Mrs. Carver's eyes widened, and for a moment her charm wavered, like a candle flickering in a draught. "How sad," she said, her voice softer now. "But I manage, Miss Marple. I've no need to resort to such measures. My husband's debts are being settled, little by little." She sipped her tea, her movements deliberate, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lingered on the cup, as if anchoring herself against the conversation's drift. "You're very resilient," Miss Marple said, her tone admiring. though I imagine a treasure like the blue Mauritius could tempt even the strongest resolve. It's worth a fortune, I'm told, enough to settle many debts." Her words were gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the crack in Mrs. Carver's polished exterior. The widow laughed, though it sounded forced. "A fortune? Perhaps, but I wouldn't know the first thing about selling such a thing. I'm no collector, Miss Marple, just a guest who happened to be there when the stamp went missing. I was in the drawing room all evening, as Mrs. Bantry can tell. I never went near the study." Her words were quick, almost too quick, and Miss Marple thought of a village girl who had once sworn she hadn't touched a stolen pie, her haste betraying her guilt. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "Though you did admire the album after dinner, you said. Did you notice anything about it? Perhaps the way it was handled, or who was near it?" Mrs. Carver frowned, as if searching her memory, though Miss Marple suspected she was crafting her response. "I don't recall much," she said. "The Colonel was showing it to Dr. Langston, I think, and Mr. Voss was hovering, as he does. Miss Thorne was there, too, looking rather bored. I only glanced at it. Such tiny things, stamps, but they seemed to mean the world to the Colonel." Her smile returned, but it was less radiant now, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush on her cheeks, like that of a village widow caught in a half-truth about a missing shawl. "You have a good memory for people," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside. "It's a gift, isn't it, to notice so much while seeming so carefree? I once knew a woman in our village, a charming creature, who could charm a room while slipping a silver spoon into her reticule. No one suspected her until a button from her dress was found where it shouldn't have been." Mrs. Carver's hand froze on her bracelet, and for a moment her eyes met Miss Marple's, wide with something like alarm. Then she laughed, the sound brittle. "You do tell the most intriguing stories, Miss Marple, but I assure you I've no spoons or stamps hidden away. I'm just a guest passing through." She rose, smoothing her dress. "Now, about that bazaar. Shall we plan something splendid?" Miss Marple rose too, her movements unhurried. "We shall, Mrs. Carver. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's chatter. I do hope we'll find the Colonel's stamp soon. It would be a shame for such a charming visit to be marred by suspicion." As Mrs. Carver left, her heels clicking on the path, Miss Marple returned to her tea, her mind sifting through the widow's words. Her charm was a polished shield, but it had cracked under scrutiny, revealing a woman whose elegance masked desperation. The mark on her wrist, the vagueness about her husband's debts, the quick denial of being near the study, all echoed the village women Miss Marple had known, whose charm hid small thefts born of need. She thought of the wax smudge on the windowsill, the scratch on the desk, and wondered if Mrs. Carver's practiced grace had led her to the study in a moment of weakness. A woman in debt, she knew, could be as driven as a man in ambition or envy. As she picked up her knitting, the needles resumed their steady rhythm, mirroring the quiet certainty that Mrs. Carver's charm, like a stamp's postmark, bore the imprint of her truth. The web of the mystery was tightening. Voss's ambition, Langston's envy, Thorne's precision, and now Carver's charm, each a thread leading to the missing blue Mauritius. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Dust. The morning sun broke through the mist over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and amber as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Bantry Hall. Her conversations with the suspects, Mr. Voss's ambition, Dr. Langston's envy, Miss Thorne's precision, and Mrs. Carver's charm had woven a tapestry of motives, each thread vibrant with possibility. Yet the heart of the mystery lay in the Colonel's study, where the blue Mauritius had vanished from its locked sanctuary. Miss Marple felt the answer was there, in the silent details of the room, and she resolved to examine it once more, trusting that the smallest clue could unravel the thief's design. Colonel Bantry met her at the door, his mustache twitching with a mix of hope and frustration. "Back again, Miss Marple?" he said, ushering her inside. "I've turned that study upside down, but I'll be dashed if I can find anything new. You've got sharper eyes than I have. See what you can make of it." Mrs. Bantry hovered nearby, her hands fluttering as she offered tea, which Miss Marple politely declined. "Not just now, Dolly," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'd like to see the study first, if you don't mind." The Colonel led her to the familiar room, its dark oak paneling absorbing the morning light, the heavy desk standing like a sentinel at its center. The glass-fronted cabinet, now doubly locked, gleamed in the corner, and the single window's brass latch shone as if mocking the mystery. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her black handbag tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the space with the quiet intensity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. "A locked room is never as secure as it seems," she murmured, almost to herself, recalling a village shop where a secure till had been pilfered by a child with a hairpin. She began with the window, drawn to the faint smudge of wax she had noticed before. Kneeling with a grace that belied her years, she examined the sill, her fingers tracing the smudge's edges. It was no larger than a sixpence, a pale residue that might have gone unnoticed by a less discerning eye. "Wax?" she said softly, her mind turning to a village jeweler who had once used wax to copy a key for a rival's safe. "Colonel, do you keep candles in this room?" He frowned, rubbing his chin. "Candles? Not here, no. There's a candelabra in the dining room, but we use electric lights in the study. Why do you ask?" She pointed to the smudge, her expression thoughtful. "This wax is curious, don't you think? It's not from a spill or a taper. It's too precise, as if pressed deliberately. A key, perhaps, or a tool." Her voice was mild, but her eyes gleamed with the spark of discovery, and she thought of the Colonel's key, always in his pocket, yet vulnerable to a moment's inattention. The Colonel peered at the smudge, his brows knitting. "By Jove, I never noticed that. You think someone used wax to— What, make a copy of my key?" "It's possible," she said, rising with care. "People are ingenious when they want something badly enough. I once knew a lad in our village who copied a church key to sneak into the bell tower. Not for theft, mind you, but for a prank. The wax gave him away, left in the vicar's candle holder." She smiled, but her mind was racing, piecing together the implications of the smudge. Next, she turned to the desk, where the faint scratch she had observed still marred the polished surface. She ran her finger along it, noting its shallow depth and curved shape, like the arc of a ring or a tool dragged briefly across the wood. "This mark," she said. "It's new, isn't it? You said you hadn't noticed it before the theft." The Colonel squinted at it, his face darkening. "New, yes, I'd swear to it. The desk was spotless before that evening. Dolly's particular about polishing. Could it be from the album, perhaps, when it was moved?" Miss Marple shook her head, her lips pursing slightly. The album's edges are soft, Colonel, and this is a sharp mark, as if something harder grazed the wood. A ring, perhaps, or a metal object. She thought of Mr. Voss's heavy signet ring, glinting as he gestured at the tea gathering, and of Mrs. Carver's emerald bracelet, which had left gruppied against her wrist. "We must consider who was in the room that evening," she said, her voice almost a whisper. The Colonel paced, his hands clasped behind his back. "Well, there was Voss, looking over the album with me in the afternoon. Langston was in later, for a whiskey and a look at the collection. Miss Thorne was here earlier, appraising some stamps. And Mrs. Carver, well, she didn't come in as far as I know, but she was about the house." His voice faltered, as if the thought of suspecting his guest pained him. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the scratch. "And you're certain no one else entered after you locked the door?" "Certain," he said. "I checked it myself before bed, and the album was still there, open on the desk. The stamp didn't vanish until sometime in the night." She moved to the fireplace, where the brass poker rested slightly, askew against the hearth. She touched it lightly, noting its weight, and glanced at the embers, long since cold. "The fire was lit that evening, you said?" she asked. "Yes, for the guests," he replied. "It was a chilly night, and Dolly thought it would be cozy. But what's that got to do with anything?" "Perhaps nothing," she said, her tone airy, though her mind recalled a village thief who had once hidden stolen coins in a chimney, thinking the ashes would conceal them. The poker's position nagged at her, a detail out of place in the orderly room. She turned, back to the Colonel, her smile gentle. "May I see the album again, just to refresh my memory?" He unlocked the cabinet, retrieving the album with care, and opened it to the empty sleeve. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting the pristine condition of the plastic, the adhesive untouched. "A careful hand," she murmured, thinking of Miss Thorne's precision, or perhaps Mrs. Carver's delicate fingers. Whoever took it knew its value and handled it with skill. The Colonel sighed, locking the album away. "It's maddening, Miss Marple. A locked room, a single stamp gone. How do you make sense of it?" She folded her hands, her eyes drifting to the smudge, the scratch, the poker. "Sense comes from the details, Colonel. A locked room is only as secure as the people who pass through it. I should like to speak with your guests again, perhaps in a less formal setting. People reveal themselves when they feel unwatched." His face brightened. "You're on to something, aren't you? I knew you'd crack this case." "Not yet," she said, her smile enigmatic. "But clues, like dust, settle in the quiet corners. We need only sweep them out." She thought of a village maid who had left a smudge of polish on a stolen silver spoon, her careful cleaning undone by a single oversight. As she left the study, Miss Marple's mind churned with the new clues, the wax smudge suggesting a copied key, the scratch hinting at a ring or tool, the poker misplaced in a room of order. Each pointed to a human hand, driven by ambition, envy, precision, or desperation. She recalled a village carpenter who had betrayed his theft with a single chip of wood, and she knew the study held the thief's mark, waiting to be read. With a quiet nod to the Bantries, she stepped into the crisp morning, determined to follow the trail of dust to its source. Chapter 9. The Motive Emerges. The late afternoon sky over St. Mary Mead was streaked with clouds, their edges tinged pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village's thatched roofs and tidy gardens. Miss Jane Marple sat in the Bantry's drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The clues from the Colonel's study, the wax smudge, the desk scratch, the misplaced poker, had sharpened her focus, but the puzzle of the blue Mauritius stamp required more than physical traces. Motives, she knew, were the true keys to human actions, and she had arranged another gathering at Bantry Hall to observe the suspects together, hoping their interactions would reveal the thread that tied clue to culprit. Mrs. Bantry had outdone herself, transforming the drawing room into a scene of cozy elegance. The silver tea service gleamed on a lace-covered table, flanked by plates of cucumber sandwiches, scones, and a sponge cake dusted with sugar. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth softening the autumn chill, and the heavy curtains were drawn back to let in the fading light. Colonel Bantry stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his mustache bristling with suppressed agitation as he greeted his guests. "Just a little get-together," he said, his voice a touch too hearty. "Thought we'd talk stamps again, clear the air after recent events." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, who sat unobtrusively in a corner, her lavender shawl draped over her lap, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. The suspects arrived one by one, each betraying their character in their entrance. Mr. Reginald Voss entered first, his wiry frame moving with a nervous energy, his sharp eyes darting to the locked cabinet where the stamp albums were now kept. He wore the same worn suit, his ink-stained fingers clutching a leather notebook, and he offered a tight smile as he took a seat near the window. "Good to see you all again," he said, his voice clipped. "Though I wish it were under happier circumstances." Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on the cabinet, like a village shopkeeper eyeing a till he could not touch. Dr. Henry Langston followed, his broad figure filling the doorway, his laugh booming as he clapped the Colonel on the shoulder. "Arthur, you old rogue, still brooding over that stamp?" he said, his green tie as garish as ever against his tweed jacket. He sank onto the sofa, his florid face beaming with forced joviality, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his jaw, like that of a village farmer who had once laughed too loudly to mask his envy of a neighbor's prize crop. Miss Clara Thorne entered with her usual precision, her gray dress as stark as her demeanor, her steel-rimmed spectacles catching the firelight. She nodded curtly to Mrs. Bantry, declining a seat near the tea table and choosing a high-backed chair instead, her hands folded motionless in her lap. "I trust this is not a waste of time," she said, her voice cool. "I have work to attend to." Miss Marple thought of a village schoolmistress who had once spoken with similar sharpness, her rigidity hiding a secret shame. Mrs. Evelyn Carver swept in last, her auburn hair glowing in the soft light, her silk dress whispering as she moved. Her smile was radiant, her emerald bracelet glinting as she pressed Mrs. Bantry's hand. "Dolly, you're too kind to have us again," she said, her voice a melody of charm. She settled gracefully on a cushioned chair, her eyes flickering briefly to the cabinet before returning to her hostess. Miss Marple noted the calculated warmth, like that of a village widow who had once charmed her way into a neighbor's confidence, only to betray it. As Mrs. Bantry poured tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation with the subtlety of a breeze turning a weather vane. "It's such a pity about the Colonel's stamp," she said, her voice soft but clear. "A treasure like the blue Mauritius must stir all sorts of feelings, admiration, perhaps, or even temptation. I heard of a recent auction in Zurich, Mr. Voss, where a similar stamp fetched a remarkable sum. It must make your work quite exciting." Voss's eyes lit up, his fingers tightening on his notebook. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple," he said, his tone eager despite himself. £20,000, and the buyer, a Swiss collector, was desperate for it. The market for rarities is booming, though it's a risky game. One wrong move, and a dealer's reputation is ruined." His voice faltered slightly, and Miss Marple saw his hand tremble, like that of a village grocer who had once spoken too quickly about a missing crate, betraying his guilt. Dr. Langston laughed, a loud burst that drew all eyes. 20,000! Good Lord, Arthur, you could have retired on that stamp." His joviality was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed on his knee, as if itching to deflect attention. "Not that I'd sell my collection, mind you. It's the thrill of the hunt, not the money." His eyes flicked to Voss, and she caught a glint of rivalry, like that of two village boys vying for the same prize at a fete. Miss Thorne adjusted her spectacles, her expression impassive. "Value is only as good as provenance," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "The Zurich stamp had a flawless history. Without it, even a blue Mauritius is just paper." Her words were directed at Voss, and Miss Marple sensed a subtle challenge, like that of a village librarian correcting a rival's cataloging, her precision a weapon. Mrs. Carver leaned forward, her smile undimmed. "How fascinating," she said, her eyes wide with feigned interest. "I had no idea stamps could be so valuable. It's like a little world of secrets, isn't it?" Her hand brushed her bracelet, and Miss Marple saw the faint mark on her wrist, a reminder of her earlier unease, like a village girl who had once hidden a stolen locket under a scarf. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Secrets indeed," she said. "A stamp like that could tempt anyone, profit, pride, or even a moment's weakness. I once knew a man in our village, a respectable clerk, who took a silver pen from his employer, not for money, but to prove he could. It was the motive, you see, that betrayed him." Her eyes moved from one suspect to another, noting their reactions. Voss's fingers twitched, and he busied himself with his tea, avoiding her gaze. Langston's laugh was a shade too hearty, his hand gripping his cup as if to steady himself. Miss Thorne's lips tightened, her spectacles glinting as she stared at the fire. Mrs. Carver excused herself briefly, murmuring about needing air, and returned with a flush that Miss Marple found telling, like that of a village widow who had once fled a room when questioned about a missing brooch. The Colonel, sensing the tension, changed the subject to a recent stamp exhibition, but Miss Marple kept her focus on the suspects. Profit is a powerful motive, she thought, watching Voss's nervous hands. Envy drives others, she mused, noting Langston's forced cheer. Precision can mask intent, she reflected, observing Miss Thorne's rigid calm. And desperation hides behind charm, she concluded, seeing Mrs. Carver's smile falter under scrutiny. Each had a reason to take the stamp, but the clues, wax, scratch, poker, pointed to a single hand. As the gathering broke up, the suspects departed with polite farewells, Voss lingering by the cabinet, Langston clapping the Colonel's shoulder, Miss Thorne nodding curtly, and Mrs. Carver pressing Mrs. Bantry's hand. Miss Marple remained, her knitting folded in her lap. "Well, Jane?" the Colonel asked, his voice hopeful. "Any closer to the truth?" She smiled, her eyes distant. "The truth is like a stamp, Colonel. It leaves an impression, however faint. We must look for the mark it left behind." She thought of a village thief who had been caught by a single crumb on a tablecloth, and she knew the motive, now clear, would lead her to the thief's door. Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The twilight shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a quiet hush as Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, the faint glow of a single lamp illuminating her knitting. The blue Mauritius mystery had reached a critical juncture, with motives laid bare. Voss's ambition, Langston's envy, Thorne's precision, and Carver's desperation, each woven tightly with the clues from the Colonel's study, the wax smudge, the desk scratch, the misplaced poker. Yet to catch a thief, Miss Marple knew, one must sometimes bait the trap with cunning. She had devised a plan, subtle yet bold, to flush out the culprit, and she had enlisted Colonel Bantry's cooperation with a conspiratorial whisper that morning. Now, as the village clock chimed 7, she prepared to join the Bantrys for a final gathering, where the trap would be sprung. At Bantry Hall, the drawing room was aglow with candlelight, a deliberate choice to create an atmosphere of intimacy and distraction. Mrs. Bantry had arranged a modest supper, the table laden with cold meats, fresh bread, and a decanter of claret, the fire casting a warm flicker over the assembled guests. The Colonel stood by the mantel, his demeanor a mix of forced geniality and nervous anticipation, his eyes darting to Miss Marple as she entered, her black handbag and sensible hat as unassuming as ever. "A fine evening for company," he said, his voice carrying a rehearsed note. "Thought we'd have a quiet night, talk stamps and, well, share a bit of news." His mustache twitched, and Miss Marple gave him a reassuring nod, her knitting needles already clicking softly as she settled into her corner chair. The suspects arrived, each betraying their unease in subtle ways. Mr. Reginald Voss entered with a cautious step, his sharp eyes scanning the room, before settling on the locked cabinet, his fingers clutching his ever-present notebook. "Another gathering, Colonel?" he said, his smile thin. "I hope there's good news about your loss." Miss Marple noted the strain in his voice, like that of a village grocer she had once known, whose nervous chatter betrayed his pilfering of stock. Dr. Henry Langston followed, his booming laugh echoing as he clapped the Colonel's shoulder, though his eyes held a wary glint. "Arthur, you're keeping us in suspense," he said, his green tie clashing with the room's muted tones. His joviality seemed forced, and Miss Marple saw his fingers drum on his thigh, reminiscent of a village farmer who laughed too loudly to mask his sabotage of a rival's crop. Miss Clara Thorne arrived with her usual precision, her gray dress as stark as her expression, her spectacles glinting in the candlelight. She declined a glass of claret with a curt nod, choosing a chair apart from the others. "I trust this is not another exercise in futility," she said, her voice sharp. Miss Marple thought of a village schoolmistress whose cold demeanor had once hidden a theft of church funds, her precision undone by a misplaced ledger. Mrs. Evelyn Carver swept in last, her auburn hair glowing, her silk dress whispering, as she greeted Mrs. Bantry with a radiant smile. "Dolly, you spoil us," she said, her emerald bracelet catching the light as she accepted a glass of wine. Her charm was undimmed, but Miss Marple noted a slight flush on her cheeks, like that of a village widow who had once used her smile to deflect suspicion over a stolen brooch. As supper began, the Colonel cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've some news," he said, his voice carrying a deliberate excitement. "It seems I was mistaken about the blue Mauritius. My appraiser, another chap, not Miss Thorne, found a duplicate in my collection, tucked away in an older album. Worth a fortune, and I'm thinking of auctioning it. Sotheby's, perhaps, or Zurich." He paused, glancing at Miss Marple, who gave a faint nod, her needles clicking steadily. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Voss's eyes widened, his notebook slipping slightly in his grasp, his face paling as if calculating the implications. Langston's laugh was too hearty, his hand knocking over his glass, which he righted with a clumsy gesture, his flush deepening. Miss Thorne adjusted her spectacles, her lips pressing into a thin line, her gaze fixed on the colonel with an intensity that belied her calm. Mrs. Carver's smile froze, her fingers trembling as she set down her wine, a faint clink betraying her nerves. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind noting each reaction, like a village baker who had once betrayed his theft of flour with a nervous twitch at the mention of an audit. "Really, Colonel," Voss said, recovering first, his voice smooth but strained. "A duplicate? That's extraordinary. You're certain it's genuine?" His fingers toyed with his notebook, and Miss Marple saw the greed in his eyes, like that of a village merchant who had once coveted a rival's stock. Langston chuckled, though it sounded hollow. "A second Mauritius? Arthur, you sly dog, why didn't you tell me sooner?" His hand gripped his napkin, and Miss Marple noted the envy in his tone, like a village farmer who had once sabotaged a neighbor's prize marrow out of spite. Miss Thorne's voice was icy. "Provenance will need verification," she said. "Duplicates are rare, and fakes are common. I'd need to see it myself." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of calculation in her eyes, like a village librarian who had once coveted a rare book, her precision masking her desire. Mrs. Carver laughed, her voice a touch too bright. "How thrilling! Another treasure in your collection, Colonel. You must be over the moon." Her hand brushed her bracelet, and Miss Marple saw the mark on her wrist, a reminder of her earlier unease, like a village girl who had hidden a stolen locket under a scarf. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her voice soft as she joined the conversation. "It's curious, isn't it, how a single stamp can stir such excitement. A fortune waiting to be claimed. I once knew a man in our village who found a hidden coin in his attic, thought it would change his life. But it brought out such greed in others, it nearly ruined him." Her eyes moved from one suspect to another, noting their reactions. Voss's twitching fingers, Langston's forced grin, Thorne's rigid posture, Carver's trembling hand. The supper continued, but the air was thick with tension, each suspect guarded in their words. Miss Marple suggested to the colonel, in a voice loud enough to be overheard, that he leave the study unlocked that night, with the duplicate stamp placed in the album on the desk. "It's safe enough now, don't you think?" she said, her tone innocent. "With so many friends about, who would dare tamper with it?" The colonel nodded, playing his part, though his eyes betrayed his nervousness. As the guests departed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting folded in her lap. "You've set the stage, Colonel," she said quietly. "Now we wait to see who takes the bait. I shall watch from the library. It has a fine view of the study door." Her smile was serene, but her mind was alert, recalling a village thief who had been caught when tempted by a deliberately left purse. She positioned herself in the library, hidden in the shadows of a tall bookshelf, her eyes fixed on the study across the hall. The house grew quiet, the servants retired, and the bantries abed. The trap was set, and Miss Marple waited, her patience as steady as her knitting, knowing that greed, envy, precision, or desperation would draw the thief to the study's open door. Chapter 11. The Thief Revealed. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, its pale light filtering through the library window where Miss Jane Marple sat, cloaked in shadow. The Bantry household was still, the servants long retired, and the ticking of a distant clock the only sound breaking the silence. From her vantage point behind a tall bookshelf, Miss Marple had a clear view of the study door across the hall, left deliberately unlocked as part of her carefully laid trap. The duplicate blue Mauritius, a convincing replica placed in the album on the Colonel's desk, was the bait, designed to lure the thief who had taken the original. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, her hands still, her eyes sharp with the patience of a hunter awaiting her quarry. She knew human nature, greed, envy, precision, or desperation would draw the culprit to act, and she was ready. The hours crept by, the clock chiming midnight, then 1. Miss Marple remained motionless, her mind alert, recalling a village poacher who had once been caught by a farmer's patient vigil, tempted by a baited trap. At last, a faint creak echoed from the hallway, the soft tread of footsteps on the polished floor. Her heart quickened, but her expression remained serene as a figure emerged from the darkness, moving with cautious purpose toward the study door. It was Mr. Reginald Voss, his wiry frame unmistakable even in the dim light. His suit, worn but pressed, rustled faintly as he glanced about, his sharp eyes glinting with a mix of determination and nerves. He carried a small leather case, and his fingers, stained with ink, trembled slightly as he pushed the study door open, its hinges silent under the Colonel's recent oiling. Miss Marple watched, her breath steady, as he slipped inside, leaving the door ajar. She rose quietly, her movements as soft as a cat's, and crept to the doorway, peering into the study. The moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating Voss as he approached the desk, where the album lay open, the replica stamp gleaming in its sleeve. His hands were steady now, his earlier tremors replaced by a practiced efficiency. He lifted the stamp with a pair of tweezers, examining it under a small pocket lens, his lips curving into a faint, triumphant smile. "Perfect," he murmured, slipping the stamp into his case. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the silence like a bell. "You thought to sell it in Zurich, didn't you, Mr. Voss?" Voss froze, the tweezers clattering to the desk, his face paling as he spun to face her. "Miss Marple," he gasped, his voice a mix of shock and defiance. What are you doing here? This is no business of yours." His hand clutched the leather case, and she saw the panic in his eyes, like that of a village grocer caught with a stolen sack of flour, his bravado crumbling under scrutiny. "It's very much my business," she said, her tone as gentle as if she were discussing the weather. "The blue Mauritius was taken with care, Mr. Voss, but you left traces. The wax smudge on the windowsill, from an impression of the Colonel's key. The scratch on the desk, from your signet ring as you lifted the stamp. You knew its value, and your debts demanded it." Her eyes, mild but unyielding, held his, and she saw his shoulders slump, the fight draining from him. He stammered, his voice rising. "You've no proof. This is just a misunderstanding. I was only checking the stamp, ensuring it was safe." His words were desperate, but his hand tightened on the case, betraying his intent. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile tinged with sadness. "You made a duplicate key, didn't you? That afternoon in the study, when you discussed the auction with the Colonel. A moment's distraction, a quick press in wax. It's an old trick, but effective. I've seen it before, in our village, when a shopkeeper copied a key to pilfer a rival's till. The wax gave you away, Mr. Voss, and your ambition sealed it." Voss's face crumpled, and he sank into the desk chair, his hands covering his eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice breaking. "My business, bankruptcy, was looming. The blue Mauritius. It was a lifeline. I thought I could sell it quietly, through a contact in Zurich. No one would know." His confession spilled out, halting and raw, like that of a village lad who had once admitted to stealing apples, his shame outweighing his greed. Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening but resolute. "You underestimated human nature, Mr. Voss. Greed leaves a trail, however careful the hand. The stamp is still in your possession, I presume?" He hesitated, then opened the leather case, revealing the original blue Mauritius, its edges pristine, its postmark vivid. "I kept it in my hotel room," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't bring myself to sell it yet. Too risky." He handed it to her, his hands trembling, and she took it with care, her fingers steady. "You'll return it to the Colonel," she said, "and we'll see what can be done. Confession, Mr. Voss, is better than discovery." She thought of a village curate who had once returned a stolen book to avoid disgrace, his honesty softening his punishment. As she spoke, the study door creaked open, and Colonel Bantry appeared, his face a mix of relief and outrage, summoned by a prearranged signal, a tap on the floorboards Miss Marple had given when Voss entered. "By Jove, Voss," he thundered, his mustache bristling. "You blackguard, my own dealer." Mrs. Bantry followed, her hands fluttering, her eyes wide with shock. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm. "Let us not judge too harshly, Colonel. Mr. Voss has admitted his fault, and the stamp is safe. The rest is for you to decide." She handed him the blue Mauritius, its blue hue catching the moonlight, and he clutched it as if it were a lost child. Voss stood, his head bowed, his defiance gone. "I'm sorry, Colonel," he said, his voice hollow. "I'll face whatever comes." He left the study, escorted by the Colonel, who muttered about calling the police, though Miss Marple suspected a quieter resolution might prevail. As the house settled back into silence, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her voice trembling. "Jane, how did you know? It was like magic." Miss Marple smiled, folding her knitting. "No magic, Dolly. Just human nature leaving its mark. A smudge, a scratch, a moment's greed. They tell the story, if you listen." She thought of a village thief caught by a single thread on a gate, and knew the blue Mauritius had found its way home, guided by the quiet clarity of her observation. Chapter 12. The Confession. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the mist to bathe the village in a soft, forgiving glow. Miss Jane Marple sat in the Bantry's drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the lavender shawl nearly complete in her lap. The events of the previous night, the trap sprung, Mr. Voss caught with the replica stamp, and the recovery of the original blue Mauritius had brought the mystery to a close, yet one final gathering was needed to tie the threads together. Colonel Bantry had summoned Voss to the house along with the other suspects to confront the truth and restore order to his shaken household. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, was there to ensure the confession was heard, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of emotions. The drawing room was less festive than before, the silver tea service replaced by a simple tray of coffee and biscuits, the fire unlit in the morning chill. Colonel Bantry stood by the mantel, his face stern but tempered by relief, the blue Mauritius safely locked in the cabinet behind him. Mrs. Bantry sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting between her husband and Miss Marple, who occupied her usual corner chair, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the tension in the air. The suspects arrived, their faces a study in unease, unaware of the night's revelations but sensing the weight of the occasion. Mr. Reginald Voss entered first, his wiry frame hunched, his sharp eyes dulled by resignation. His suit, once pressed, hung loosely, as if mirroring his defeat, and his ink-stained fingers clutched no notebook, only the edge of his sleeve. He avoided the colonel's gaze, taking a seat near the window, his silence louder than any protest. Dr. Henry Langston followed, his boisterous demeanor subdued, his green tie absent, replaced by a somber gray one. "Arthur, what's this about?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual boom, his eyes flickering with curiosity and apprehension. Miss Clara Thorne arrived with her customary precision, her gray dress as stark as ever, her spectacles glinting as she surveyed the room. "I hope this is brief," she said, her voice crisp but tinged with unease, as if she sensed the net closing. Mrs. Evelyn Carver swept in last, her auburn hair less vibrant, her smile strained despite her efforts at charm. "Colonel, Dolly, you look so serious," she said, her voice faltering as she took a seat, her emerald bracelet catching the light but failing to mask the nervous twist of her hands. The colonel cleared his throat, his hands clasped behind his back, his mustache bristling with restrained indignation. "Thank you for coming," he began, his tone measured. "I've called you here because the matter of my stolen blue Mauritius has been resolved. The thief has been found, and the stamp recovered." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Voss, who shrank further into his chair. A murmur rippled through the group, Langston's sharp intake of breath, Thorne's slight adjustment of her spectacles, Carver's quick glance at the cabinet. Miss Marple watched them all, her needles clicking softly, her mind noting their reactions, like those of village gossips at the unveiling of a scandal. The colonel continued, his voice hardening. "Miss Marple, with her remarkable insight, set a trap last night, and the culprit walked into it. Mr. Voss, would you care to explain yourself?" His gaze fixed on the dealer, who seemed to age under its weight. Voss rose, his hands trembling, his face ashen. I confess," he said, his voice barely audible, cracking under the strain. "I took the blue Mauritius. My business was failing, debts piling up. The stamp, it was worth a fortune, enough to save me. I thought I could sell it in Zurich, through a discreet buyer. No one would know." His words spilled out, halting and raw, like those of a village shopkeeper who had once admitted to skimming the till, his shame laid bare before his neighbors. He turned to the colonel, his eyes pleading. "I made a duplicate key that afternoon when we were in the study. You were distracted, talking of auctions, and I pressed the key into wax I'd brought in my case. It was easy, too easy. That night I slipped back, used the key, and took the stamp. I was careful, but—" He faltered, glancing at Miss Marple, who met his gaze with quiet compassion. But you left traces, she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. The wax smudge on the windowsill from your impression, the scratch on the desk from your signet ring as you lifted the stamp. Small things, Mr. Voss, but they tell a story. I've seen it before, in our village. A carpenter who left a chip of wood, a maid who left a smudge of polish. Human nature is never as clever as it thinks. Voss nodded, his shoulders slumping. I kept the stamp in my hotel room, hidden in a book. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, not yet. Too risky. When you announced the duplicate, I thought I could take it too, and be done with it. He sank back into his chair, his confession complete, his ambition reduced to ashes. Langston's face flushed with indignation. "You blackguard, Voss," he bellowed, his fist clenched. "To think I sat with you, shared a drink, while you plotted against Arthur." His anger was genuine, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of relief in his eyes, as if his own envy had been absolved by another's guilt. Miss Thorne's lips pursed, her voice cold. "A disgrace to the profession," she said. "Your carelessness was predictable. Provenance is everything, and you've ruined yours." Her words were sharp, but Miss Marple saw a trace of satisfaction in her posture, like a village schoolmistress who had outshone a rival. Mrs. Carver's hand flew to her throat, her smile replaced by a look of shock. "Oh, Mr. Voss, how could you?" she said, her voice trembling. "To betray such kindness." Yet her eyes darted to Miss Marple, and the older woman sensed a hidden relief, like that of a village widow who had escaped suspicion over a missing trinket. The colonel stepped forward, holding the blue Mauritius, its blue hue vivid in the morning light. "It's back where it belongs," he said, his voice gruff but softened by relief. "Voss, I trusted you, years of dealings, and this is how you repay me." He paused, glancing at Miss Marple. "But Miss Marple's shown me there's no need for a scandal. You'll leave Saint, marry Meade, Voss, and never deal in my circles again. The police can wait, for now." Voss nodded, his face etched with defeat. "I understand, Colonel. I'm sorry." He rose, his steps heavy as he left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes wide. "Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know it was him?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Human nature, Dolly. It's the same in St. Mary Mead as anywhere else. Greed, envy, precision, desperation. They all leave marks, like footprints in a garden. Mr. Voss's ambition was his undoing, just as a village lad's greed once betrayed him over a stolen pie." She thought of the wax, the scratch, the poker, each a silent witness to the truth. As the others departed, Langston with a gruff nod, Thorne with a curt farewell, Carver with a tremulous smile, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting nearly complete. The colonel clasped her hand, his gratitude plain. "You've saved me, Miss Marple. That stamp's more than a treasure. It's my pride." She inclined her head, her smile gentle. "Pride is a fine thing, Colonel, but truth is better. Keep your treasures safe and your friends closer." She stepped into the morning light, her shawl finished, the mystery resolved, and the village once more at peace, its secrets laid bare by the quiet clarity of her observation.